The devil doesn't want you to hear this, and that alone is the reason you must listen with all your attention. Every time truth is spoken, darkness trembles. Every time light is released, lies begin to collapse. The enemy thrives on noise, confusion, fear, and distraction, because when you are distracted, you stop listening, and when you stop listening, you start doubting what God has already promised you. The reason you have faced resistance is not because you are weak, but because you are dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. The enemy never fights what is already defeated, he fights what is about to rise. If your life feels under attack, if your peace has been disturbed, if your faith has been tested, it may be because you are closer to your breakthrough than you realize. The devil's goal is simple: stop you from hearing the truth long enough so you give up on it. The enemy works hardest when your breakthrough is near, because opposition is often the clearest sign that something powerful is about to happen in your life. Resistance does not appear randomly, it rises when progress is forming beneath the surface. Many people mistake pressure for failure, but in the spiritual realm, pressure often means movement. Just before change takes place, the battle intensifies. Just before freedom arrives, chains seem tighter. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a punishment. It is evidence that what God is doing cannot be ignored by darkness. When you are far from purpose, there is little need for attack. But when you begin to grow, to pray deeper, to believe stronger, to step closer to what God has promised, the enemy becomes uncomfortable. He fears momentum more than anything else. He understands that once you cross a certain point, you will not be the same again. That is why confusion suddenly increases, why old habits try to return, why discouragement feels heavier than before. These moments are designed to make you stop just short of victory. The enemy knows timing matters. He often strikes not at the beginning, but near the end. He wants you exhausted, emotionally drained, and questioning yourself right before the breakthrough arrives. If he can convince you that nothing is happening, you might walk away from the very answer you have been praying for. Many people quit in the final stretch, not because the promise wasn't real, but because the pressure felt unbearable. The enemy counts on impatience and doubt to do what he cannot do himself. You may notice that challenges appear suddenly after moments of hope. You decide to trust God more, and suddenly problems multiply. You choose faith, and fear tries to speak louder. This is not proof you are on the wrong path. It is often proof you are on the right one. Light provokes resistance from darkness. Growth provokes opposition from fear. The enemy does not waste energy attacking empty ground, he attacks future territory. Understanding this changes how you respond. Instead of panicking when things get harder, you stand firmer. Instead of assuming God has left you, you recognize that something is shifting in your favor. The enemy cannot stop what God has ordained, but he can try to wear you down emotionally so you surrender voluntarily. That is why endurance matters. Perseverance turns pressure into power. Every breakthrough is guarded by resistance. Every promise is tested by delay. What feels like the hardest season may actually be the final preparation. If you remain steady, if you keep believing, if you refuse to let opposition redefine your faith, you will discover that the very moment you thought was meant to break you was actually meant to carry you into something greater. Fear and distractions are some of the most effective weapons the enemy uses, not because they are strong on their own, but because of how quietly and consistently they work on the mind. Fear rarely arrives loudly at first. It often begins as a small thought, a subtle question, a quiet worry that slowly grows if it is given attention. Distraction works the same way. It pulls your focus away from truth and onto uncertainty, until what once felt clear becomes blurred. The enemy does not need to destroy your faith outright. He only needs to keep you from focusing long enough for doubt to take root. Fear is designed to distort perspective. It makes tomorrow feel heavier than it truly is and makes today feel impossible to survive. It convinces you that what lies ahead is worse than what God has already carried you through. When fear controls the narrative, faith is pushed to the background. You may still believe in God, but you stop believing God for yourself. That is the danger. Fear does not always deny God's power. It questions whether that power will show up for you. Distractions reinforce fear by keeping your mind scattered. A distracted mind struggles to hear clearly. When your attention is constantly pulled in different directions, you lose the stillness required to recognize truth. The enemy knows that clarity comes in quiet moments, so he fills your life with noise. Endless worries, comparisons, disappointments, and even harmless-looking busyness can keep you from recognizing what God is speaking. You may hear many voices, but not the one that brings peace. When fear and distraction work together, they create paralysis. You feel overwhelmed, unsure of what step to take next. You overthink instead of obeying. You delay instead of moving forward. This is not because you are incapable, but because your focus has been divided. A divided focus weakens confidence. The enemy understands that a focused believer is powerful, but a distracted one is easy to discourage. Fear also thrives on imagination. It shows you outcomes that have not happened and may never happen, yet your body responds as if they are real. This drains emotional and spiritual energy. Meanwhile, distractions keep you so busy reacting that you never challenge those fearful thoughts. Over time, fear becomes familiar, and distraction becomes normal, even though neither was meant to rule your life. The key is recognizing fear and distraction as intentional tactics, not personal failures. When you understand that these feelings are weapons used to interrupt your growth, you stop blaming yourself and start guarding your focus. Paying attention to what you allow into your mind becomes an act of strength. Attention is valuable, and where it goes determines what grows in your life. When fear is confronted and distractions are reduced, peace begins to return. Faith becomes easier to access, and direction becomes clearer. The enemy loses power the moment you realize that not every thought deserves your attention, and not every distraction deserves your time. Truth has the power to set a person free, while lies are designed to keep the mind and heart bound. The enemy understands this deeply, which is why deception is one of his primary strategies. He does not always present lies as something obviously wrong. Instead, he mixes them with partial truths, emotions, and past experiences, so they feel believable. A lie gains strength not because it is true, but because it is repeated often enough to feel familiar. Over time, what is familiar can begin to feel like fact, even when it is not. Lies shape how you see yourself. They whisper that your past defines you, that your mistakes disqualify you, that change is impossible. These thoughts do not arrive suddenly. They develop slowly, taking root through disappointment, rejection, or repeated failure. When left unchecked, they become internal beliefs rather than external attacks. Once a lie becomes a belief, it begins to direct decisions, limit expectations, and weaken confidence. You may stop trying not because you lack ability, but because you have accepted something false as unchangeable truth. The danger of lies is that they often sound reasonable. They appeal to logic without hope and realism without faith. They tell you to lower expectations so you won't be hurt again. They convince you that guarding your heart means closing it off completely. In trying to protect yourself, you unknowingly build walls that also block healing. The enemy does not need to lock you in chains if he can persuade you to stay where you are. Truth works in the opposite way. Truth may initially feel uncomfortable because it challenges what you have grown used to believing. It exposes what is false and demands a response. When truth enters the mind, it disrupts the patterns built by lies. It reminds you that failure is an event, not an identity. It reveals that weakness can coexist with growth. Truth brings light, and light removes the power of hidden things. Freedom begins when truth is accepted, not just heard. Hearing truth without embracing it changes nothing. Acceptance requires humility and courage because it often means admitting that something you believed was wrong. But that moment of surrender is where chains begin to fall. When truth replaces lies, thought patterns shift, emotional responses change, and behavior follows. You begin to see yourself through a clearer lens, not as broken beyond repair, but as someone still in process. The enemy resists truth because truth removes control. Lies keep you dependent on fear, past pain, and false limits. Truth restores responsibility and authority. It reminds you that you have a choice in what you believe, what you focus on, and how you respond. The moment truth takes root, bondage loses its grip, not through force but through understanding. God's voice brings clarity in confusion, not by adding more noise but by cutting through it. Confusion thrives when too many voices compete for attention. The mind becomes crowded with opinions, fears, past experiences, and imagined outcomes. In that state, decision-making feels heavy and direction feels uncertain. The enemy uses confusion as a tool to delay progress, because a confused person often hesitates, and hesitation can keep someone stuck longer than fear ever could. Clarity, on the other hand, creates movement. God's voice is not aggressive or overwhelming. It is steady, calm, and purposeful. It does not rush you, shame you, or pressure you into panic. While the enemy pushes urgency rooted in fear, God offers direction rooted in peace. Even when the message is challenging, it carries assurance rather than anxiety. This is how clarity begins to separate itself from confusion. Confusion feels chaotic and draining, but clarity feels grounding, even when the path ahead requires courage. Many people struggle to recognize God's voice because they expect it to compete with louder sounds, but clarity often arrives in stillness. When distractions are reduced, guidance becomes more noticeable. God does not struggle to be heard. It is the noise around us that drowns out understanding. The enemy benefits from that noise because as long as there is confusion, there is delay. When clarity comes, excuses lose power and avoidance becomes harder to justify. Clarity does not always mean knowing every step in advance. Often it means knowing the next right step. God's voice rarely reveals the entire plan at once because growth requires trust. Confusion demands certainty before obedience, but clarity invites obedience before certainty. This shift changes how faith operates. When you trust the guidance you receive, even in small portions, momentum begins to build, and confusion loses influence. In moments of uncertainty, the enemy often tries to create pressure by exaggerating consequences. He wants you to fear making the wrong choice so deeply that you make no choice at all. God's voice counters this by reminding you that direction is not dependent on perfection. Growth comes through willingness, not flawlessness. Clarity gives permission to move forward without knowing everything. As clarity increases, peace follows. This does not mean circumstances immediately change, but your response to them does. When you know you are being guided, pressure loses its weight. Even challenges feel manageable when direction is present. Confusion drains energy because it keeps you mentally divided. Clarity restores energy because it brings alignment between belief and action. The enemy fears clarity because it empowers. Confusion keeps people reactive. Clarity makes them intentional. When God's voice is heard and trusted, fear begins to loosen its grip. Direction replaces doubt, steadiness replaces panic, and movement replaces stagnation. Persistence in faith weakens spiritual attacks because endurance disrupts the enemy's strategy. The enemy relies on weariness more than strength. He understands that if he cannot stop faith immediately, he can try to exhaust it over time. Attacks are often designed to be repetitive, not overwhelming. The same doubts return, the same struggles resurface, the same questions echo again and again. The goal is not instant defeat, but slow surrender. Persistence refuses to cooperate with that plan. Faith that persists is not loud or dramatic. It is steady and deliberate. It shows up even when emotions do not. It continues praying even when answers seem delayed. This consistency confuses the enemy because it removes his leverage. When circumstances fail to silence faith, his influence begins to weaken. Persistence proves that belief is not dependent on feelings, outcomes, or convenience. It is rooted in commitment rather than comfort. Spiritual attacks often intensify when progress is made. This is not because faith is failing, but because it is effective. Persistence sends a clear message that pressure will not produce retreat. Every time faith chooses to stand instead of withdraw, strength increases. What once felt heavy begins to feel manageable. The enemy's attempts lose their emotional impact because familiarity replaces fear. When you recognize the pattern, the power of the attack diminishes. Persistence also reshapes identity. Instead of seeing yourself as someone constantly under attack, you begin to see yourself as someone who endures. This shift matters because perception influences response. When endurance becomes part of how you see yourself, you stop panicking at resistance. You expect opposition, but you no longer fear it. The enemy thrives on reactions fueled by anxiety, but persistence responds with calm resolve. Over time, persistent faith creates spiritual stability. Attacks may still occur, but but they no longer shake the foundation. Stability frustrates the enemy because it removes urgency. When fear cannot rush you and doubt cannot rush you, control slips away. Persistence slows everything down and allows clarity to take hold. It replaces emotional reactions with intentional choices. Faith that endures also builds quiet confidence. You may not see immediate results, but you notice internal change. Peace lasts longer. Hope recovers faster. Discouragement loses its grip more quickly. These are signs that persistence is working beneath the surface. The enemy measures success by disruption, but persistence measures success by continuation. Eventually, attacks lose their purpose. When pressure no longer produces retreat, it becomes ineffective. The enemy cannot sustain effort where there is no response. Persistence does not eliminate opposition overnight, it outlasts it. In doing so, it turns what was meant to weaken faith into something that strengthens it instead. Listening carefully has the power to change your destiny because attention determines direction. What you repeatedly listen to shapes how you think, and how you think shapes how you live. Many lives are not ruined by one major decision, but slowly redirected by small voices that went unchallenged. The enemy understands this, which is why he works so hard to influence what you give your attention to. If he can control what you listen to, he can influence what you believe, and belief eventually becomes behavior. Careful listening requires intentional focus. It means slowing down enough to recognize which voices bring peace and which bring pressure. Not every thought deserves agreement, and not every voice deserves trust. Some voices excite fear, stir impatience, or promote comparison. These voices rush you toward decisions rooted in anxiety. When you listen carelessly, you may accept guidance that feels urgent but leads nowhere. Discernment begins when you choose to pause and evaluate rather than react. Destiny is rarely changed in dramatic moments alone. It often shifts in quiet decisions made over time. Listening carefully helps you notice subtle redirections before they become major consequences. A single ignored warning or a single unexamined thought can lead far off course. On the other hand, one moment of careful attention can protect you from years of regret. Awareness guards your future long before outcomes are visible. Listening also trains alignment. When you consistently pay attention to truth, your internal compass becomes more accurate. You begin to recognize what feels right, not because it is easy, but because it is consistent with what you know to be true. The enemy fears this alignment because it removes confusion. A person who listens carefully becomes harder to mislead. Deception relies on haste, not patience. Many mistakes happen not because guidance was absent, but because it was ignored. In moments of pressure, loud voices often drown out wise ones. Careful listening requires humility, because it means admitting that immediate desires may not always be right. It creates space between impulse and action, allowing wisdom to speak. This pause is powerful. It interrupts cycles that once felt automatic. As listening becomes intentional, confidence grows. You begin to trust your discernment because it has been sharpened by attention. Fear loses influence because it is recognized rather than obeyed. Destiny begins to align not through force, but through consistency. One wise decision leads to another, and direction becomes clearer over time. The enemy loses control where attention is guarded. When you listen with care, distractions lose strength and lies lose credibility. Truth becomes easier to recognize because it has been given room to speak. Destiny is shaped by what you hear, but it is secured by what you choose to listen to.